Family, in my opinion, should be a place of safety, love, and acceptance where you know that no matter how difficult life becomes, someone will always be there to embrace you. Home signified love, safety, and unwavering support to the majority of people. However, for me, opening that front door seemed more like whispering my way into a place where I didn't truly belong, where my presence was accepted rather than valued. My world started to fall apart on a cool Saturday afternoon. At my parents' place, it was meant to be simply another family get-together. My oldest brother, Adam, was bringing his new girlfriend here, and my younger sister, Emily, was coming from out of state with her husband and children. Everyone appeared eager to catch up, exchange tales, and chuckle over cherished recollections. Unfortunately, I wasn't informed about it. I learned of the meeting by chance. Adam had told someone else about it. I told myself that it must have been an oversight, a mistake, in an attempt to keep the hurt from overwhelming me. Despite my hesitation, I decided to go in the hopes that my presence would serve as a reminder that I was still a member of this family. I was a little late, partly due to traffic, but primarily because I was anxious. I entered and heard laughter coming from the living room, along with the subtle scent of roasted chicken. My mother's upbeat voice welcomed someone, most likely my sister or my brother's new girlfriend. However, as I entered the living room from the hallway, all talks abruptly stopped. Almost like a rapid intake of breath, their laughing came to a sudden halt. My mother finally remarked, "Oh, you came," in a tone that was deliberately cold and unwarm. A strange shiver went down my spine as I forced a feeble smile. No warm greetings, no embraces, only courteous nods and swift eye averting. My arrival interrupted a private joke that everyone else seemed to be in on. The enormous dining table was meticulously arranged for precisely 7 people, not 8, and there was not a single seat vacant. The lack of an extra chair bitterly reminded me that no one had anticipated my arrival. Embarrassed, I stealthily retrieved an extra stool from the corner and positioned it clumsily at the edge of the table. During dinner, they conversed freely, yet each time I tried to add something, my words seemed to vanish into oblivion. I had the impression that I was speaking through soundproof glass, with every word fading into silence. Every now and again, someone would look at me, seemingly shocked that I was still there, but they would swiftly look away. I sat there shoving food around my plate while carefully masking my surprise and hurt with a fake smile. The anguish didn't stem from public insults. The anguish stemmed from the continuous, subliminal reminders of my insignificance. As dessert arrived, my mother happily shared pieces of her renowned cheesecake, explaining that she had made it especially for Emily's request. I got the smallest, partially crumbled corner, haphazardly arranged on a little, chipped plate, while everyone else got a substantial portion. No one invited me over when the family later gathered in the garden for a group shot. I observed in silence, standing to the side with an empty dish. With a delighted smile, my father embraced Emily and Adam. They had a smile on their faces that I hadn't seen in a long time. Once more, I was invisible, a ghost haunting my painting of my family. My siblings had already started getting ready to go by the time nightfall rolled around. They exchanged warm farewells, made plans to return, and promised to stay in touch shortly. My mother merely nodded absently as I stood in the doorway, trying to say goodbye, her eyes already turning to Emily's kids. "Drive carefully," she said, without glancing at me. I felt the weight of loneliness crushing down on my chest as I made my way slowly to my car, and I looked down at the screen of my phone as it began to slowly buzz. The family group chat was the source of the alert, but it wasn't the one I knew. My heart fell when I opened the note, bewildered. I had never seen a chat with the designation family only before. As I read the opening lines, my mother's comments rang uncomfortably vividly, and I gasped. "I'm glad she's gone. Dealing with her was tiresome." Adam's response swiftly surfaced behind it. "I understand, correct? She resembles an emotional parasite of some sort." Next came Emily's message. "Exactly," constantly seeking attention and focusing on herself. My hands started to shake violently. I was utterly broken and numb. Did they think I was a burden? A parasite? Now it was obvious this was a deliberate mistake, not an accident. For years, they had purposefully avoided talking to me. They really saw me like this. Amidst the cold wind whipping around me, I remained motionless next to my car, tears stinging my eyes. Every suppressed emotion and every moment I'd spent trying to win their approval flooded back to me in a devastating wave. However, a tiny voice started to murmur a single question in the deepest, most damaged part of me, and it sparked something I had long forgotten inside of me. I keep trying to impress them, but why? Perhaps I was afraid of losing the only family I had ever known, which is why I may have remained silent for so long and accepted this agonizing obscurity. However, things were different this time. The depth of this treachery was too enormous to overlook or forgive. I clutched my phone while I wiped the tears from my eyes. They had no idea that I had overheard their private exchange. They were unaware of what I had just discovered. They also had no idea what I was going to do next. I had already experienced feelings of alienation inside my family. Years of subdued rejections, discreet disappointments, and carefully masked hurts had been covering up this agonizing realization. Before I looked back and saw the pattern for the first time, each isolated moment had appeared unimportant on its own. Emily, my younger sister, was always the family's favorite. When we were kids, Emily was the one who was easily consoled whenever we clashed or fought, as siblings always do, because her cries attracted attention right away, and her merest accomplishments were lavishly praised. When she walked into a room, I could clearly recall how my parents' faces would light up, how she could command their laughter and grins with such ease. I stood silently in the darkness, wondering why I never felt their warmth. Adam, my elder brother, had always been praised as the ideal child, the trustworthy, accountable one. The athlete, the scholar, the unfailing son, he was the pride and delight of the family. His credentials and awards were proudly displayed by our parents all over the house. My accomplishments, on the other hand, were frequently greeted with courteous nods or mild dismissals, regardless of how important they were to me. My mother would respond absently, "That's nice," before swiftly returning the focus to Adam's most recent achievements. Throughout my early and teenage years, I convinced myself that being the middle child, loved yet ignored, was just the nature of the role. However, that trend remained constant even as an adult. I went to every birthday celebration and family get-together in the hopes that one day they would recognize me for who I truly was. I made thorough notes of their preferences, recalled their memorable moments, and readily offered my assistance even when it was never reciprocated. I spent weeks running errands, calming Emily's nerves, and helping her prepare every aspect of her wedding. I voluntarily moved back into the shadows to make sure she was happy. They hardly appeared to notice, though, when I had to deal with my heartbreak, a devastating separation from a long-term relationship. My family's silence during that trying time was deafening. When I finally mentioned it, my mother remarked sharply, "You'll get over it," her eyes already moving on to something more fascinating. Despite their lack of interest, I persisted in trying. I thought they would finally recognize my value if I just put in a little more effort and made myself indispensable to them. I volunteered to pick up people from the airport late at night, took care of my parents when they were sick, and looked after Emily's kids whenever she needed it. I ignored my obligations to satisfy their insatiable demands, even as my own work grew more and more difficult. However, my father's critical illness was the pivotal event that altered everything. He had had a stroke, and ongoing attention and monitoring were necessary for his recovery. My mother turned to me right away, expecting me to fill in without hesitation. She gently emphasized that Adam couldn't possibly abandon his significant career because Emily had children and a busy life of her own. Naturally, I was the one who had to make the sacrifice and temporarily quit my job. "I take it. You don't mind?" Although it wasn't exactly a question, my mother asked. I nodded, obeying as always, sacrificing my aspirations, my job, and my mental well-being to provide for my family. I became my father's full-time caregiver, spending long nights by his bedside, supporting him during therapy sessions, doctor's appointments, and the excruciating anguish of recuperation. Weeks followed by months, each characterized by emotional strain and quiet determination. However, the more I contributed, the less apparent I got. Emily came over from time to time with flowers and cheerful chatter, staying long enough to show her appreciation before abandoning me to deal with the challenging reality of day-to-day care. Though he seldom ever showed his face, Adam proudly claimed to be there in spirit and sent encouraging messages. Friends praised my commitment, describing me as courageous and selfless, yet those I most yearned for to acknowledge me were unconcerned. Many lonely hours were spent wondering if they would ever realize how much I cared and how much I had sacrificed. But every show of love and loyalty only reinforced their belief that my help was a right, not something to be valued or respected. My sense of value gradually diminished throughout these protracted months spent alone in my family's house. I told myself that taking care of my father was enough to make me worthy of their gratitude. However, resentment grew deep within, taking root in the rich soil of their unwavering disdain. The pain was unbearable when my father finally died. He had been the only person who had subtly valued my presence throughout those trying months. I fought through my grief as the burial drew near, thinking that maybe now my family would finally see what I had done. Rather, the fact that nothing had changed became brutally obvious. My mother and siblings gave moving eulogies during my father's funeral, replete with tales from his life that I had personally experienced, yet somehow felt omitted of. They thanked doctors, nurses, and even distant friends, but they never mentioned me by name. The anxiety only grew in the days after the funeral. During my father's sickness, I heard my mother consoling Emily, complimenting her strength, and thanking her for the few hours she had been able to spare. Adam received comparable recognition for keeping everyone's spirits high and calling in occasionally. Instead of being acknowledged as a tremendous act of love, my months of committed caregiving were simply erased and written off as a silent expectation. Then came the last blow, the instant that confirmed all of my hidden fears. After the funeral, as family members gathered to console one another, I heard my mother and Emily talking behind a closed door. She simply hovers around, hoping for pity. Emily muttered quietly, her frustration evident in her tone. It's exhausting. My mother's response was even more painful. She constantly takes advantage of other people's feelings and expects us to commend her for fulfilling her obligation. I couldn't have predicted how severely the realization would hit me. The secret group conversation wasn't an isolated incident, rather. It was the beginning of a bitterness that I had been oblivious to for far too long. They saw me as merely an emotional parasite who preyed on their emotions in an attempt to get favor and recognition. I felt something deep inside of me finally break as I stood there, silently taking in their hurtful remarks. After years of silently enduring their disdain, I felt hollow and worn out. I had reached the limit of my emotional ability due to my father's illness and death. But here I was, still unnoticed and unappreciated. But a flame lit inside me at that dreadful epiphany. A question kept repeating in my head, getting louder and more demanding. How much longer will I let myself be invisible? Seeking their recognition or acceptance was no longer the goal. It was about taking back my self-worth and dignity. At that moment, I realized I needed to escape the position parents had given me, that of the submissive, silent daughter who took their emotional scraps without protest. I muttered to myself, my voice trembling with sorrow. I've been silent for too long. Things will be different this time. They would be too. They didn't know it then, but I was ready to show them how different things could be. In the days following the burial, I found myself trapped within the echoing walls of my former residence. The stillness my family left behind was perhaps more burdensome than the loss of my father. Knowing what people really thought of me made me feel even more alone, and every hour that went by became a mute monument to that loneliness. I had always thought that my superpower was swallowing the hurt. My strength was silence. I had persuaded myself that it made me honorable, admirable, and noble. The silence, however, had grown oppressive this time. My sister Emily called a week after the funeral. Usually when my sister Emily called, I eagerly listened to her, taking in her grievances and burdens. This time, all I could feel was fatigue as her name appeared on the screen. Hesitantly, my thumb lingered over the green button. I let myself ignore her for the first time. Strangely, I felt lighter after the phone went silent, as if I had set down a bulky suitcase that I had been carrying for years. Even though it was only a minor act of defiance, something changed inside of me. I came to the realization that just not responding at all might be the most effective approach. I started doing this silent disobedience more frequently throughout the course of the following few weeks. I graciously declined when my mother called to beg me to do errands and take care of household duties that Emily was too busy to do. It was almost satisfying to hear the surprise in her voice. "You're denying it?" With astonishment, she inquired. Despite my heart pounding quickly, I gently said, "I have other commitments today." I was aware that she was expecting me to provide more details, defend myself, and convince her that I would be available the following time. However, I just hung up the phone, leaving her perplexed. I felt in control for the first time, free from guilt and the need to satisfy others. At first, it was difficult. Every time I put myself before them, a recognizable terror set in the worry that they would reject me even more, that I would lose the little acceptance or love I had held on to for so long. But something amazing occurred with every decision I took for myself. I became stronger. I gradually realized that my socialization had conditioned me to accept neglect as the norm. I had never had such a sensation of freedom as I stood at the brink of this new understanding. After weeks of separating myself, I went to a family meal one evening out of duty more than choice. The typical scene awaited me as I walked into the dining room, Adam talking confidently about his profession, Emily at the center of attention, and my mother skillfully directing the conversation around them. I wasn't surprised that no one noticed my tardiness. Rather than becoming offended, I sat down quietly and watched them as though from a distance. When Emily said she needed someone to keep her kids over the weekend, the topic of conversation suddenly changed. All eyes slowly moved in my direction, and there was a palpable sense of hushed expectation. Usually, the moment was my cue, my automatic reaction to offer to help, to save the day, to prove that I was deserving of their love. I didn't move, though, this time. At last, Emily turned to face me with eager eyes. "I assume you're free this weekend?" The room appeared to get smaller as everyone's eyes were fixed on me, anticipating the accustomed obedience they had assumed. "I already have plans," I said softly, taking a steady sip of water as the astonished hush rippled over the table. You could just feel the shock in Emily's eyes. "Plans?" With skepticism, she repeated. "Yes, yes," I said firmly, maintaining eye contact with her. My mother became agitated, obviously unsure of how to react to my firm response. "Could you please clarify what the plans are currently addressing?" My mother asked in a tight voice that hardly concealed her annoyance. I briefly thought about defending myself, reverting to my cozy justification routine. However, I felt they had already stripped me of my dignity enough after recalling the hurt of what they had said and the name they had given me. They couldn't take any more, in my opinion. I said, softly but plainly, "I don't need to explain." The words felt strange but incredibly fulfilling. "I've got other things to do. You can find someone else, I'm sure." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line as her face darkened. Adam averted his gaze as he uncomfortably cleared his throat. Despite my mother's attempts to shrug it off, there was definitely tension. For the first time, they were beginning to realize that I was no longer their dependable emotional sponge, always there and obedient. I was thinking about the car's soft hum as I drove home that evening. In some way, the path ahead was more obvious, and the burden of their disappointment behind me was less heavy than I had anticipated. The fortitude I'd found in just saying no had rocked something deep within the family dynamic. The following day, I unintentionally discovered yet another upsetting discovery, which, considering their history of secrecy, I probably should have expected. My mother's phone buzzed on the table as I was cleaning up her living room, displaying notifications from a well-known app. I froze, looking down casually. A fresh message appeared on the screen in all its painful simplicity. "Did you see her last night, Emily? She seems to have suddenly taken on a significant role in her life. So dramatic. Adam, she's most likely just trying to get attention once more. Refuse to give in. You are aware of her personality." My mother's response came next, and it pierced me more deeply than the others. "Mom, she's attempting to show that she doesn't require our help, but she will return eventually. She does it every time." I felt paralyzed for a minute, caught between the roiling rage and the terrible hurt, like the oxygen were draining from my lungs. However, despite the misery I was experiencing, a startling realization came to me. There was a threat to them. My newfound freedom upended the cozy roles they had given each of us. They required me to stay inconspicuous, unnoticeable, and predictable. It was painful to read what they had to say, yet underlying the pain was a surprising resolve. Perhaps for the first time, I realized that their nastiness was rooted in insecurity and a fear of losing their emotional power. It was never really about me, rather, it was about their need to push me into their positions to feel safe and superior. I refrained from confronting them. I decided not to confront them just yet. I chose a more subdued approach, calm activity, silent defiance. I started putting my life back together without a word, establishing boundaries, gathering proof of their abuse, and getting ready financially and emotionally for the separation I intended to establish. I scheduled an appointment with a therapist, which I had always desired but had always written off as needless or self-serving. I proceeded with plans I had put off for years, dreams of following my passion, taking a course I had put off, and taking back my identity free from their approval. Every day turned into a small but significant step toward taking back my identity. Every choice I made without their input, every limit I established, and every instance of my strength seemed revolutionary. I quickly stopped responding to SMS, maintained courteous but aloof communication, and let our quiet deepen. I realized very well that their group chat was not about me. Rather, it was a reflection of their own inadequacy and incapacity to see my value. A week later, my mother called at last, her voice strained with annoyance disguised as worry, and I replied coolly, "Where have you been?" Unable to conceal her irritation, she made a strong demand. I grinned quietly, experiencing a level of power I had never known. I took care of myself and responded simply, speaking in a steady, composed tone. The ensuing quiet said more than words could. She wasn't sure how to react, how to deal with this new side of herself, for once. Even if there was only a brief hush, it was sufficient to indicate a change in authority. It was enough for me to fully recognize the strength I had found. They had referred to me as an emotional parasite, but they were now gradually realizing that they could no longer eat me. I gave myself permission to have a peaceful moment of contentment that night, while I was sitting by myself on my couch. Although I hadn't yet faced them head-on, I had taken the initial steps toward a significant change in my quiet, resolute manner. This was only the start. Knowing exactly what I was going to do next, I smiled inwardly. I had learned that fanfare and fireworks aren't usually used to signal change. The most significant changes might occasionally start off quietly, either from the quiet bravery of refusing requests or from the nuanced resolve that comes with newly discovered independence. I committed myself to a quiet, targeted mission in the weeks after that stressful family dinner and the pain of learning of their secret chats. They had spent years entangling me in the role of emotional carer, always ready to absorb their anguish and frustrations, and I gradually but deliberately untangled myself from the web of their expectations. But I had moved on from those times. I meticulously deliberated on my next move, quietly enhancing my capabilities in private. It started with the most basic yet significant of acts. I eventually submitted my resignation from the modest family-run business where I had worked for almost 8 years. My family had considered this position more like a charity they reluctantly extended than a legitimate career I had earned. My fingers quivered just above the keyboard the morning I typed the email of resignation. I had been dreading this day for years, picturing the rage, the charges, and the consequences. However, all I experienced when I hit send was relief, a profound, purifying sense of liberation. I kept it a secret from everyone. I didn't warn them or make an announcement. I simply released it, silently taking off the largest chain they had around me. Within hours, the phone calls started. My older sister Emily was the first to speak, her voice harsh with bewilderment disguised as worry. "Are you serious? Could you please let us know why you didn't reach out to us initially?" "Mom is very worried." I imagined their astonishment and smiled gently. I gently replied, "I didn't realize I needed permission, but this is so careless." Emily sighed in irritation. "You are discarding everything we provided for you." The words stung for a moment. "You gave me everything?" With a trace of irony in my voice and a composure I had never dared employ before, I echoed softly, "I believe you meant to take everything." I could tell my words had a profound effect because of the quiet on the other end of the queue. Emily abruptly ended the call, allowing me to listen to my heartbeat, a strong, regular rhythm that gave me confidence that I was at last headed in the right direction. Then, predictably, my mother called. Her voice was carefully controlled and clipped. "Are you intentionally trying to make us appear unprofessional?" she yelled at once. I inhaled deeply before answering, keeping my composure despite the underlying annoyance. "No," I firmly said. "I'm only now starting to make my own decisions. If that makes you feel embarrassed, I apologize." She let out a quick exhale, clearly frustrated. "After everything we've accomplished, after all of your actions," I cut in politely but aggressively. "Are you certain that you want to go there?" I could tell by the lengthy silence that followed that she was carefully weighing how far she wanted to take this talk. After a while, her tone became more measured and icy. "We'll see how long you manage without us." I gave a sour smile. "I guess we will." My heart pounded when I hung up, but it was with confidence rather than fear. This episode was neither a tantrum sparked by bitterness nor the frantic revolt of my childhood. The knowledge that I had at last regained control of my life was a serene clarity. I took more discreet action in the days that followed, implementing things that I had been thinking about for months. My mother and I had a joint bank account, so I closed it and moved my share to a different account they would never access. I started putting my possessions in boxes and packaging them properly. I had already made plans to move into a modest flat across town, a place that was completely mine, away from their oversight, their judgment, and their influence. I still hadn't revealed my plans to anyone. I just went ahead in silence, resolved not to allow them to influence or undermine me this time. But word of my independence traveled fast. Emily's texts became more desperate as she demanded answers. "You can't simply walk away. Mom needs you." One evening, her tone changed from rage to a peculiar desperation as she messaged, "This family needs you." I stopped and looked down at what she had said. The irony was nearly comical. They had branded me weak, needy, and an emotional parasite for years, but they had come to understand how much they had relied on me when I finally broke free. "You'll all get along just fine without your emotional parasite," was my succinct and definitive response. My phone kept ringing with texts as I packed up my belongings in preparation for the transfer the next morning. Pleas, accusations, and hollow excuses. I refused to succumb to their manipulations and ignored them. Memories came flooding back to me that night as I lay awake in my childhood bedroom for the last time. I reminisced about the numerous hours I devoted to resolving conflicts between my parents, the evenings I spent comforting Emily after their breakups, and the years of silently bearing the burden of everyone's suffering without acknowledging it. These memories filled me with resolution for the first time, rather than sadness. Before my mother came downstairs, I had quickly packed and arranged my belongings in a tidy stack by the door. Her eyes grew wide with shock and incredulity. "Are you really doing this?" I gave a soft nod. "Indeed, yes, I am." She parted her lips, trying to find something to say. "Do you see how self-centered this is? Do you realize the sacrifices your father and I made?" A flash of ancient remorse rose in my chest for a brief instant. However, I didn't allow it to develop this time. "What about the sacrifices I made?" My voice remained steady as I whispered my question. "Have you ever seen those?" Her eyes flickered with anxiety, and her face reddened slightly. "You're overstating things," she said sternly. "We always took care of you." One steadfastly met her stare and shook my head slowly. "No," I replied sternly but kindly. "You put me to use. There is a distinction. But don't worry, this distinction won't affect you." Shock and wrath mixed in her gaze, and her mouth hung open a little. After a moment of stuttering, she composed herself. "All right," she said icily. "Proceed. However, when you realize your error, don't back down." With a clear, serene gaze, I picked up my keys. I answered, with a little smile on my lips, "Don't worry, I won't." As I drove away, my childhood home vanished from my view. I was aware that the conflict was far from finished. They would try to reintegrate me into their cycle and avoid losing control. For the first time in my life, however, I was ready not with bitterness or rage, but with silent, resolute strength. On the seat behind me, the phone buzzed constantly as messages came in from Adam, my mother, and Emily. They begged me to change my mind and demanded explanations and apologies. However, I continued to drive, the messages unanswered, each mile separating us a step closer to the tranquility I had long sought. Nothing they said or did could bring me back into their shadow now that I had finally escaped. They had lost their emotional parasite. Now they would have to face life without my support. I had doubts about their survival or demise. To be honest, though, I realized for the first time in my life that it was no longer my problem. I let myself smile honestly at that silent idea, sensing the start of something fresh, something wholly mine, and I felt in my heart that the roles had finally started to change. I discovered a kind of tranquility I had never experienced in the weeks after my departure. However, I was also aware that this peace was only a transitory one, a brief respite before the impending storm. My family had centered their life on me, subtly taking on their emotional weight. Now that I was out of the way, their meticulously crafted facade was starting to fall apart. They were still unaware of how I had learned. I had observed their private conversations and read the messages referring to me as their emotional parasite. They thought I was still simply a rebellious daughter going through a phase, still upset or angry. However, I had something they had never expected: silent, indisputable evidence. I waited for a family event that I knew they would be very anxious for me to go to. It was an extravagantly planned celebration of my mother's birthday, a public display of family harmony, a deception they had mastered over the years. My mother messaged me several times, alternating between subtly threatening and manipulatively feeling guilty. She texted, "Everyone will notice if you're not there," as if my absence would make her feel worse than my independence did. I decided where to go, but only if I wanted to. The commotion instantly subsided when I entered the opulent hotel ballroom that evening. Curious and sometimes critical eyes turned towards me. Dressed immaculately, my mother stood close to the head table, her smile breaking a little at my sudden presence. Beside her, Emily and my brother Adam exchanged a cautious look. As though nothing had changed, I greeted family friends and distant relatives with a calm, courteous grin. However, I sensed a subtle, simmering strength within. Drama and confrontation, the boisterous public scenes my family liked, were not the focus tonight. It was about bringing them to realize what they had been avoiding for years: the quiet reality. I got up quietly after dinner and the speeches that were required, full of flowery admiration for my mother. There was no formal announcement or fanfare. It was just me, getting up from my seat and stepping confidently and calmly up to the podium. My mother's beautifully manicured face was filled with distrust as she studied me with narrowed eyes. My mother dismissed Emily's desperate whisper in her ear and waved her away, forcing herself to regain her detached composure. I turned to face the packed room at the podium. "Good evening," I said quietly and steadily. "I'm sorry to have interrupted this lovely evening. However, I must say something crucial." There was a silence in the room, a mixture of interest and bewilderment. With a flimsy grin, my mother tried to look encouraging, but her eyes told me to be wary. I had seen this silent threat countless times before: keep quiet and avoid embarrassing the family. I inhaled steadily and looked her in the eye. I gently remarked, "I've played a specific role in my family for many years. I've mediated, listened, and offered assistance. I have silently maintained peace, provided comfort, and absorbed grief. I have always felt that it is my responsibility to ensure that families care for one another without reservation." The audience, who were unaware of our reality or the hidden wounds beneath our polished veneer, let out a few murmurs of approbation. However, I recently learned something painful, so I proceeded quietly, speaking in a calm, measured tone. This experience finally opened my eyes. My mother shifted uneasily, indicating to Adam and Emily that they needed to step in. However, I halted them abruptly with a gentle hand lift. They were momentarily taken aback by my silent power. "Allow me to continue, please," I said evenly. I calmly removed printed copies of carefully selected screenshot snippets from their private family group chat from my pocket. They had written me off as needy, weak, emotionally draining, and an emotional parasite during the same conversation. In a series of chats with my mother, sister, brother, and some close relatives, I learned this, I added, my voice never faltering, never rising. Talks one was never supposed to hear. Abruptly, her eyes opened in amazement, upending my mother's composed exterior. Whispers rose steadily. And Emily went pale, looking around the room anxiously. Adam turned away, his face displaying guilt. They called me an emotional burden in secret for years, but I kept quietly explaining the facts without making accusations. The emotional parasite sapped their joy, someone they didn't love but endured out of duty. The room was filled with gasps, and then a thick, uneasy quiet. My family members' faces, now scarlet with shame, rage, and terror, were the focus of anxious glances. Regaining her poise, my mother stepped forward abruptly. "This is absurd!" she yelled, her voice trembling a little. "I have no idea what you're discussing." Silently, I gave her the pages. She looked down and saw her own harsh words printed in front of her, her face growing paler. There seems to be a misunderstanding, as she made another modest attempt. I calmly but firmly held my stance and shook my head gently. "There is no miscommunication," I responded quietly. "This is the reality. The truth is painful, but it's true." She started to reply, but I went on in a low voice. "Drama and retaliation are not why I'm here. I'm here to declare that I'm no longer willing to play the emotional scapegoat for you. I've had enough of bearing the burden of your suffering. I take back my independence and dignity right now." I turned to the visitors for a moment and spoke honestly and directly. "I apologize for bringing the subject up tonight, but sometimes keeping quiet just makes the pain worse. Occasionally, the only path ahead is the truth." I turned back to my mom and spoke in a quiet tone, just for her. "You claimed that I was nothing and that I could never live without you. In actuality, though, I've come to understand that you've always needed me much more than I have ever needed you." Desperate for control, her eyes flared violently. "You dare?" Calmly. I raised my hand once more. "No," I replied forcefully, but calmly. "You are no longer the focus of tonight. It's about me coming out of your shadow at last." I then moved away from the podium. There were just a few muffled tears and sporadic whispers to break the terrible silence. Emily was crying quietly now, unable to look me in the eye. Adam stood motionless, his face displaying shame. With each calm, dignified step, I made my way steadily towards the exit. No one stopped me. No one dared to speak. I hesitated for a moment as I opened the door, turning one final time to see their astonished expressions staring back at me. Without saying another word, I silently closed the door behind me and strolled out into the chilly night air. Silently, the burden I had been bearing for so long, their expectations, their judgment, and their callous disregard slipped away. I took a deep, purifying breath as I stood by myself outside the motel. The altercation hadn't been dramatic or noisy. The truth had been quiet. The truth was simple yet powerful. I had quietly and without retaliation revealed to them who I really was. I wasn't the helpless, dependent kid they had persuaded themselves I was. They could never have predicted my strength and resilience. Tonight was about liberation, not retaliation. And the silence I'd left behind told me all I needed to know as I fled into the night. At last, they could see me clearly. At last, they had figured it out. It was too late now, though. Once the roles had permanently shifted, there was no turning back. My family experienced an odd, oppressive silence in the days after my silent confession at the party. I always thought this moment would feel triumphant, but instead I experienced a sense of relief mixed with grief. At last, I had emerged from their shadow, leaving them astonished by my unexpected success. I didn't take pleasure in their humiliation. I only wanted the truth, not retribution. And now, at last, they could clearly see that. Word got around fast, as it always does in a small town. Numerous messages were sent to me by distant family members, old coworkers, and even old friends. Most of them expressed amazement, although some subtly acknowledged that they had anticipated it. However, I chose to ignore the rumors since I would rather not add to the turmoil. After completing the necessary tasks, it was time to move on and concentrate on reconstructing my life in a dignified manner. Meanwhile, my family struggled to cope. Their carefully cultivated image suddenly collapsed, exposing them in a way they had never experienced before. My mother, who had spent her entire life controlling every story, now faced incessant whispers. Her calls started coming in daily and eventually hourly, ranging from irate demands that I make amends for what I had done to more subdued, deceptive requests for forgiveness. However, no one answered any of the calls. I knew it was merely desperation, not true regret, because I had heard it all before. Soon after, I received calls from my sister, Emily. With tears in her eyes, she begged me to remember the family, as though I hadn't done so all my life. For once, her emotional antics no longer made me feel guilty. At the same time, Adam was oddly silent. My brother appeared to be truly ashamed, possibly acknowledging for the first time that he was responsible for my suffering. Over the weeks, mutual contacts began to inform me that my parents were indeed facing accountability. Their close friends gradually, but quietly, started to distance themselves from them after becoming disillusioned with their facade. Dinner and function invitations rapidly ran out. I knew it hurt them, but I didn't feel sorry for them. The foundations upon which they had built their reputation over the years, lies and cruelty, had suddenly fallen apart. Maybe now they would realize how much harm they had done. Long bolstered by our family's meticulously maintained image, Emily's marriage also began to show signs of weakness. When her spouse realized the truth about her private life, he began to reconsider everything. Emily's frantic calls persisted, turning from entreaties to resentment as she blamed me for all of her issues. However, her blame no longer troubled me. I was well aware that I had nothing to do with her discontent. Never had it been. And at last, Adam, the silent, thoughtful Adam, sent a brief message. I was mistaken. I apologize. Although they were simple words, they had a deeper impact on me than I had anticipated. I didn't immediately respond, though. I owed no one, least of all right away, any forgiveness. We would all need time to heal. I started to reconstruct my reality subtly as my family dealt with their collapsing one. I felt free to discover my true self outside of their definitions for the first time. Friends whom I had previously ignored because I was so preoccupied with family responsibilities were now extending their compassion and goodwill. Laura, an old acquaintance, asked me out to coffee one afternoon. Still cautious about relying too much on other people, I hesitated. I did, however, agree to her gentle insistence for some reason. That casual coffee date turned into a lifesaver. Laura created a secure space for me by listening without interrogating or giving unsolicited advice, which was something I had rarely experienced. We had a natural, unforced talk without any pressure from me to console or encourage. For once, I was free to just be myself, to laugh or cry, to share, and to do so without feeling guilty or judged. After our encounter, I felt lighter than I had in a long time. My family's interference opened up previously limited employment prospects. A friend recommended me for a job at a tiny organization. I hesitated at first, doubting my value as usual. I realized, however, that I was no longer who they had persuaded me to be. They said I couldn't have joy, peace, or purpose without them, but I had the right to seek it. I was nervous on my first day at the nonprofit, but it soon became something remarkable. My coworkers were courteous and encouraging. They valued my abilities and generosity without ever taking advantage of me. I gradually discovered that I was becoming more confident, a silent power that came from respect for oneself rather than from approval from others. I was once again filled with simple yet profound joy. I impulsively went hiking with coworkers one weekend. I had a profound epiphany as I stood at the top of the trail and gazed down at the valley below. I had lived my entire life bearing the responsibilities of my family, certain that this was my calling. Now that I was free, I could clearly see the beauty that their shadows had obscured. After several months, my parents' desperate attempts at patching things up slowed down. At last, they realized that I would not be returning. Their emotional scapegoat was no longer me. One evening, while the sun was slowly setting outside my apartment window, there was a soft knock on my door. When I opened it, I was surprised to see Adam standing there, awkwardly gripping a small, wrapped box. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said softly as he turned to face the ground. "However, I want you to know that I truly apologize. Even though none of us acknowledged it, you are always the strongest member of our family." I smiled quietly as I accepted his gift, a plain notebook. I was surprised by how easily I was able to say, "I forgive you, Adam." However, forgiveness does not imply a return to the previous state of affairs. I am unable to. I won't either. Slowly, he nodded in comprehension. He said, I don't expect you to. However, we might be able to create something new. This could potentially lead to the creation of a superior product. I experienced a new sense of peace as I gently shut the door behind him, a profound, restorative tranquility. I had changed, but my family might never really change. I no longer required their recognition or approval. Their opinion of me or their approval did not determine my value. At last, I realized that I was a person deserving of kindness, respect, and true love. And for the first time, as I sat calmly and watched the dusk turn into soft darkness, I understood that real freedom wasn't a show or a commotion. It was quiet, soft, and peaceful in ways I never would have thought possible. The family I believed I needed was no longer with me. However, in losing them, I had at last discovered who I was. And that was sufficient for now. It's funny how life can teach us things we didn't ask for. In retrospect, I see how the emotional brutality of my family influenced not just my suffering, but also my fortitude, resiliency, and ultimately my independence. They left me with invisible wounds that left a lasting impression, but I might never have realized who I really was or what I deserved if I hadn't had those scars. I started creating a totally new existence in the months after Adam's visit. It was genuine even if it wasn't ostentatious or spectacular. Every day felt lighter, more meaningful, and full of fleeting moments of true joy. I stopped caring about pleasing other people or dreading family phone calls in the mornings. Rather, I awoke to silence the lovely kind, brimming with subdued possibilities and expectation. My current employment at a nonprofit quickly evolved from a job to a passion. Assisting those who had experienced hardships similar to mine brought me true delight. For the first time, I could clearly see how my personal experiences with loneliness and rejection helped me better comprehend other people. I have a special talent because of my traumatic past, genuine empathy. Converting my own pain into healing for someone else felt incredibly significant. Initially strangers, my coworkers gradually turned into a helpful group of friends. We checked in during tough weeks, had informal Friday night dinners, and celebrated birthdays together. I discovered that kindness and respect for one another, rather than duty or emotional reliance, might be the foundation of friendship. Knowing that people truly appreciated my company for who I was, not for what I could offer economically or emotionally, was liberating. Because of our open communication and understanding of one another, Laura and I became even closer. After supper one evening, she inquired softly, "Do you ever miss them?" While sitting quietly on her porch, I inhaled deeply as I gave her question careful thought. I occasionally gave quiet answers. Instead of missing them for who they were, I miss what I always wished they could be. Desperate for approval that never materialized, I chased a fantasy for years. But now that I think about it, I see that their acceptance will never be enough to satisfy the void inside of me. I was the only one who could accomplish that. Laura nodded. She fully understood and didn't require any other explanation. I gave her question a lot of thought as I drove home that evening. I did miss the concept of family. It was genuine. Family, however, was more than just blood. It was about respect, kindness, support, and caring for one another, things I had hardly ever experienced from people who were my genetic relatives. A seed was sown in my heart by that notion, which gradually blossomed into a peaceful reality I lived by every day. Family isn't necessarily the folks we are born with. Family might sometimes be the stranger whose generosity lifts your spirits on a difficult day, the buddy who listens without passing judgment, or the coworker who celebrates your accomplishments without feeling jealous. One could choose family something that is purposefully, lovingly, and consciously constructed. I started saving money covertly as my career took off, pursuing a desire I'd had since I was a little child, but had always put on hold to take care of other people. I decided to build a little bookshop in the center of town because I had always liked books and the solace they offered when I was feeling lonely. A warm, cozy room with cozy chairs, bookcases brimming with tales, and the subtle murmur of discussion. It would serve as a haven for me as well as for those who require solace, tranquility, and a break from the stresses of life. My friends came together in support of my idea and showed sincere enthusiasm and encouragement. Laura stood next to me on opening day, holding my hand tenderly as we saw customers strolling along the welcoming aisles, grinning subtly and discovering new worlds between the pages. I felt a wave of gratitude sweep over me at that same instant. The harsh remarks and mistreatment from my family no longer defined who I was. My dreams, my decisions, and the compassion and love I experienced all around me now shaped who I was. I was sorting books in the quiet store one afternoon when I heard the door open softly. I glanced up to see Adam entering, his face tentative yet kind. We had kept a polite distance since his apology, but I could tell something significant had changed in him by the sincerity in his eyes. "I wanted to see this for myself," he said gently as he walked up and began to go through the shelves. "Here, you've created something exquisite." "Thank you," I said softly. Before he said another word, we stood in relaxed silence. With a hint of regret in his voice, he acknowledged that Mom and Emily had not changed. "However, I now see that you were correct all along. Even though admitting it hurts, I now see the truth. I really apologize for anything." I smiled reassuringly at him. "You are, I'm sure. And I'm grateful for that. We have no control over them, but we do have a choice in how we proceed." Adam gave a slow nod. "I hope we can reunite as a family someday, but on your terms." I honestly answered, feeling hesitant yet hopeful. "We can try." I said this carefully and slowly. Instead of causing harm, family should be a place of healing. As Adam departed, vowing to maintain a courteous correspondence, I experienced an additional sense of tranquility. Forgiveness didn't require me to forget or acknowledge past wrongs. Rather, forgiveness was about letting go of the burden of holding onto grief, resentment, and fury. It was plain, unadulterated freedom. As the months went by, my bookshop grew into a cherished community institution. People come to relax, read, and occasionally just chat. I would frequently listen in silence while people discuss their difficulties and, for the first time, feel understood. I came to see that the ultimate victory, a silent but significant retaliation against years of feeling invisible, was to create a place where people felt noticed, respected, and safe. Perfection had never been the aim, yet my life was no longer flawless. There was peace, and I had discovered that serenity in the small things, the silent giggles with friends, the leisurely evenings spent reading, and the ability to be who I am without seeking approval. I could plainly see my traumatic journey in retrospect, from emotional neglect to self-discovery, from quiet suffering to strong independence. For years, I thought my value was based on what I could do for others, so I was called an emotional parasite. I now realize, however, that I was never a burden. My presence, my needs, and my feelings were important. They have always been important. As the sun began to set in the tranquil sanctuary of my bookshop, I contemplated the multitude of individuals who could find themselves in similar situations. After years of emotional neglect, I felt compelled to share my story with them to demonstrate that it was possible to recover one's value and achieve serenity. Therefore, if you've ever felt like an outsider and been wrongly labeled by people who ought to have protected you, please keep this in mind. You don't cause trouble. Your emotions are important. The people who don't see your value don't define you. Not all family is blood. Sometimes you can find family in people who support your goals and recognize your strengths. I found the purest, most profound form of retaliation of all when I decided to live a life that was solely determined by my satisfaction and value, rather than by proving myself. You are not alone if you have ever felt unwelcome in your family. You deserve to be treated better. And believe me, that better life, one that is full of dignity, love, and peace, is also waiting for you.